again. Okay, we welcome to the Beef on Dairy Dialogue webinar series, an extension of the annual Dairy Beef Short Course held in conjunction with the Central Plains Dairy Expo each March. The short course is the longest running program focusing on steers with dairy genetics in the U.S. with 15 years of continuous programming. The short course is sponsored by the I-29 MU University, a consortium of extension specialists from Iowa State University, University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and South Dakota State University. The I-29 MU University Beef on Dairy Dialogue webinar continues today with Dr. Alfredo DiCostanzo discussing the fiber requirement for feeding cattle with beef on dairy genetics. Dr. DiCostanzo started as University of Nebraska Beef System Extension Educator in March of 2022 after serving for nearly 30 years as a faculty member at the University of Minnesota. The desire to provide science-based support to consultants and feedlot operators and managers drove this move. His main areas of focus are nutrition and management of cattle feedlots and cow-calf operations. Although his academic training is in nutrition, he integrates facilities, management, and economics into his work to provide comprehensive responses to production challenges. As I always say, Alfredo, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, and thanks to everyone that has joined us and will join us, hopefully. This presentation is based on a fairly recent Discover conference, so if you had the opportunity to attend the conference, you may see some data that is quite similar. If you didn't get the opportunity to travel to Illinois in mid-October, then this is your chance to catch up to it. And the whole premise of this conversation really comes from that title, which is from a perspective of requirements, what is truly the ruminant requirement for fiber. So if you would oblige me, I'm going to spend a little time addressing that question first from a broad ruminant perspective, bovine to be specific, but also moving on from there to apply those concepts to beef on dairy. And my background from way back in Minnesota was we were working with Riverview Complex, beginning, you might say, in the baby steps of what to feed and how to feed these beef on dairy cattle, even to the point where we were comparing the performance of cattle that were sired, all Jersey cross or Jersey background, against some of those limb flex by Jersey crosses that Riverview was attempting in those early days. And obviously, the beef on dairy cross outdid the Jersey cattle. But since that time, and Riverview moved on to bigger and better things, as they should, the question, at least for me, remained in my mind, what about a little bit more fiber in the diets of beef on dairy cattle, at least early on after they arrive from the calf ranches? So let's get started with some of the basics of this conversation, which is what truly is the requirement for fiber for a ruminant animal. And so this question should be approached from one of several contexts or perspectives. So the one is, does the host, in this case the cow, or the microflora, the microbes, require fiber, and then for what? So from a cow perspective, it's a simple question. Does a cow need fiber for maintenance and productive processes for a minimum operation, shall we say? But with that premise, and we will visit this concept a little later, the question is if I fed them zero fiber, would they die? So think about that from that perspective. I think you know the answer to that question already. More importantly, from a microflora perspective, what biochemical processes associated with fermentation require fiber? So, as you're asked this question, or you ask this question to yourself, the perspectives are multiple. And if I add one more concept here, is if fiber is not consumed, what are the consequences? Is it that cattle are going to have reduced sustenance? Are they going to die? Does it create a chronic condition, perhaps disease susceptibility, reduced productivity? And if this is going on for a long time, health-wise, is there a problem that can be created that would end up in perhaps a situation where the long-term viability of the operation would be in jeopardy? And the other way to ask this question is there an optimized approach where greater profitability and greater sustainability is achieved? So if you assume that zero fiber gets you $2 of return, does 3% fiber get you $4 of return? You know, that's the way they have to kind of look at this, and that's the concept we're going to look at for the rest of the presentation when we get to beef and dairy per se. So to bring everyone a little bit to the same concept, at least my bias coming into this presentation is for a beef and dairy animal, very similar to a dairy animal going into the feedlot. This is what life looks like. So, you know, they're born, they're weaned, they go into a nursery situation, a calf ranch. They come back to a feedlot where they're received and then get into what is called a feedlot finishing diet. The segment right here on the far right would be roughly 350 days. The receiving segment might be 28, maybe 56 days. And of course, there's some debate as to how long these segments are. And many of you probably in the audience know these segments way better than I would know. So the question really is what can we do between the nursery and the feedlot? And we will not call it receiving. It would be whatever the names, formalities that we use currently for native beef cattle to use on the beef on dairy cattle. Would it be a growing diet? Could it be on grazing, etc.? That's truly the question we will answer after answering the question, how much fiber do cattle need to function? So one way to answer this question, there's many, many ways to answer this question. So I picked two or three for you today. I think that if you do your own research and do this type of analysis, you should be able to come up with similar conclusions, which really are that, for instance, in a study by Blank et al. In 2009, the purpose of the study was to evaluate a multiclonal antibody preparation made out of egg product from obviously hens that have been treated with certain antigens. Never mind any of that. The concept or the question that we're asking here is, can we create acidosis, and then will acidosis kill these animals directly or indirectly, et cetera, et cetera? So the basis of this study was to feed these heifers for about 90 days on just hay. Acidosis induction was feeding 2.5 kilos a day until intake would be depressed, or acidosis by a ruminal pH of 5.5 would be observed. The target concentrate intake in this particular experiment was 12.5 kilos per animal per day, which you can imagine that's a pretty high number at about 25 pounds of just concentrate, which in this case was ground barley and ground corn and that concentrate. So you will recognize on this study that on the blue bars we will have intake, and you might obviously remember that prior to day zero, these heifers are consuming hay, and then they were offered concentrate at the rate of 2.5 kilos a day until they would reach 12 and a half or acidosis developed. But the hay was still presented to them through the entire study. As you can see here, on the days prior to acidosis, intake continues to increase until the point of the acidosis day, or day zero. That's when the ruminal pH was considered 5.5, or concentrate intake was 50% of the previous day. And you can see that that intake continues to be depressed on day one after acidosis, with recovery of intake back to day four, which it reaches levels similar to day -3. So in essence, the intake element of acidosis in this particular study did not last very long. The amount of concentrate in the diet is provided here on the far right, indicating that it climbed from about 50% consumption of concentrate in the total intake of those animals to about 80%, dropping back on the day of acidosis. And guess what? These heifers recovered quite rapidly and came right back up on day four after acidosis. You will see this in our conclusions, but these were 12 heifers, and 4 of them never developed acidosis. So at least for those 4, we might say they do not need any fiber in their diets. Setting up what might be a little complex discussion here before we get into this. We have in the smaller figures here, 127, 127, 125, etc. That would be rates of gain. On the 5.3 and beyond, oops, for some reason that's not going to want to show. I thought it was going to, well, wait a minute. Let's try that again. Anyway, the point of that is that for whatever reason it's not showing. The point of this slide is that this level of concentrate feeding is about 85% concentrate with 15% forage. This one would be 100%, sorry, here we go again, 100% concentrate with 0 forage. And the red line would indicate the rate of gain. And I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat that again. This is 85 and 100%. And then the red line is concentrate feeding, and the blue line, I'm sorry, with pot scrubbers, which for those of you that are trying to catch up to what I'm trying to say here, it is the plastic pot scrubber you could find in any kitchen that was added to these cattle orally. And so you would have the red line represented by cattle that received pot scrubbers, about 8 of them prior to this study, and there was about 80 head of cattle in this study. The blue line would be cattle that never received pot scrubbers, but again, this is 85% concentrate intake. This is 100% concentrate intake. You can see that cattle that received pot scrubbers actually gained more weight when they were fed 100% of their diet as concentrate. Cattle that this broken line would be feed conversion efficiency. The figures are not appearing, but it'll be less than 5.3 pounds of feed dry matter to each pound of gain. And you can certainly see that that trend is actually going to be for the better. In other words, fewer pounds of feed per pound of gain, indicating once again that there is no requirement for fiber. And in fact, plastic pot scrubbers can serve as a helper if we even had a problem with rate of gain or feed conversion early on. And those cattle that receive the scrubbers actually perform better at 100% inclusion. So as a summary to these 2 studies, as I said before, 8 out of 12 heifers developed acidosis. 4 were labeled acidosis resistant. From a diagnosis perspective, 5 of the heifers were called acidotic based on lower ruminal pH, 3 of them by reduction in intake. Recovery took within 4 days, and they were back to not normal, but well on their way to recovery. From the pot scrubber study, using the scrubbers improved gain at the same dry matter, and it was considered by the author as a not fully a roughage substitute. In other studies where acidosis was attempted, Campanier reports a low incidence of occurrence of acidosis. So my conclusion to this first part of the presentation is there's really no requirement for maintenance of microflora function or the specific host's productive response. To further support that, if you look at this graph right here, where we have data from Mertens or Zellmer, it doesn't matter what data you pick, the response variable is rate of gain. The independent variable is NDF in each of these two formats. It really doesn't matter what format it is. What we're really concerned or looking at here is the values closest to zero. And for that matter, we can even use these intercepts here on your left panel, indicating that at zero or near zero inclusion of fiber in the diet, cattle are continuing to thrive at 1.2 or 2.5 pounds of rate of gain, or almost 3.2 pounds of rate of gain in either one of these two data sets. So the reason on the left you see this sets of intercept on the panel, it would mean that for when we're looking at dry matter intake, if we totally had a fallout of cattle that are not getting enough fiber, these values ought to be all zero, whether we're looking at rate of gain or dry matter intake expressed as a percent of body weight or expressed as kilos or pounds per day. So just supporting the conclusion I have made, which is we really do not need that extra fiber for the things we're intending to do. So at zero NDF, in the various expressions of NDF, dry matter intake is not zero and rate of gain is not zero. So given that energy or protein supplied are not limited, there's really no NDF requirement for maintenance or growth. Increasing NDF generally results in greater intake, but it also results in lower rate of gain. So then the next question to ask is, what are we going to do with this information if we don't feed any fiber, if we feed very little fiber, are we going to have stress conditions, reduce productivity? Is this economically sustainable? Is there an optimum somewhere where we can preserve profitability and sustainability? And that's really where the rest of the conversation will come in today. So when you look here, for example, if we have the original system, which is a receiving and a finisher diet post-weaning, the questions that we will ask in the rest of the presentation is, can we put them out on grass, as we call in this country a stocker system, then grow them a little bit on a high forage diet and then finally finish them? Or can we just put them in the drylet with a grower diet and then finish them for the rest of their finishing period? So to answer that question, I relied on meta-analyses. It's a very small meta-analysis, so you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but understand that strict statistical concepts were applied. This is a list of the studies that were recruited into that analysis. The one thing I want to be very clear about is that I will separate my meta-analysis into what is called a finishing system. So cattle would go directly to a finishing system almost regardless of the final concentration of fiber in that diet. That will always be the control. And then for the treatment, we will call this a grow finish system. And for example, if you take this South Dakota State study, I chose to keep as finishing system a 28-day growing program on high forage as the control, and then the other two treatments where cattle were received for 56 or 84 days with that original high fiber diet as the grow finish system. So put it this way, this is my way of sort of recruiting more studies where the specific objective of the analyses of the study was not just simply a finishing versus grow finishing contrast. I don't want to go through all of these, but to explain that at least for one or two of these studies, The grow finish was represented by a grazing period and then finished up obviously as a finishing period. And then they did have a contemporary control in which those beef and dairy cattle were fed a high energy finishing diet from day one. Another important feature of the meta-analyses is that many of the studies, about half of them by at least number of replications, cattle were finished by a set number of days on feed. I will come back to this comment later. And about the rest of the studies, cattle were finished based on how much of a fat cover they had. Were they ready, as we say in this country, were they finished? I might brush through these briefly so we don't spend too much time on them, but suffice it to say that these cattle represented what the systems do in this country from a finishing perspective at about 1,500 pounds of final weight, about 19 pounds of intake with 3.3 feet, rate of gain, 5.3 feet conversion. Carcass weights are fairly representative of at least beef and dairy before we got into this period of time in the U.S. where we need cattle, so these carcass weights are getting heavier. Ribeye areas are representative of a finished animal. Fat covers quite appropriate for beef and dairy cattle. Good marbling scores with this number representing a low choice number and even a average choice number. And then carcass value was calculated from all of the carcass data to do an analysis on that. So I will introduce the participants to what is called Hedges G. If you are familiar with this, pardon me, I'm going to spend a little time talking about it to describe what it is. It's really a dimensionless statistic, which one could consider standardized differences between two means based on units of pooled standard deviation. So when you see, for instance, on each one of the sets of slides that you're going to see from here on, these studies or these differences between two means represent each of the means that could be, recruited from each of these studies. So in essence, we had mostly 7 means for the purpose of this meta-analysis. And the last one where it says overall, that represents what the final Hedges G for the comparison of finishing versus grow finishing, in this case, for average daily gain during the final finishing period. In many cases, it was 150 days for cattle that were grown or grazed, and it was about 300 plus days for cattle that were directly on a finishing period. So on this one, when I read the p-value of 0.10, it refers to this particular chart right here where I'm putting the dot. And this number would correspond to about 0.5. So if you want to use the actual number, it'll be closer to 0.5, indicating that there's a tendency for finishing rate of gain to be better if cattle are grazed or grown on high forage for a period of time before they are finished. Hopefully this explains it for the rest of the slides, which will mostly be made up of this type of chart. This only represents my own personal bias that some of the grazing studies, and this one is one of them, tend to give even greater rate of gain. Obviously, as part of this mini meta-analysis, there are some studies here representing rates of gain that were equal or below what the finishing control was at, and therefore they happen to fall right on the line of zero difference or below that. But just keep in mind that I'm going to be highlighting some of the studies that I think tend to bring additional interest to the fact that we might be doing okay if we grow these cattle a little slower for a little while. This is for dry matter intake during the finishing period. Again, 100 and plus days for grow finish cattle and over 300 days for finishing cattle, with a tendency for a better intake a very small number, as you can see here, probably not quite to 0.25 units of Hedges G. And in this particular case, again, a study or two where cattle were grazed with a greater intake. This has happened too in native breeds that are taken out to grass. They come back to the feedlot. They have greater intake capacity and they reveal it with greater intake. As important as anything else, feed conversion in this case, no significant difference either way with a numerical negative to the cattle that were grow finish. But again, a few of the studies indicating that perhaps there's a tendency in some of the cattle that are grazed to be able to have a better feed conversion once they come into the feedlot. So keep that in mind. The green or red circles, as you will see, are sort of my speculations. As I said, this is a mini meta-analysis. We're hoping for more data to come in, and there's very little data out there. If we move on to final body weight, in this case, really no effect, no negative, no positive, obviously, from grazing cattle or putting them out on a high grain diet, and then hot carcass weight, again, a p-value of 0.35 should not get anybody excited one way or another. Again, some of the studies that on which cattle were grazed, and this is these two studies and these two studies, there's a tendency for in those studies to see more or heavier carcass weights just because they have a greater capacity to eat, they have a greater capacity to get heavier, obviously. The next set of slides represents what I call system average daily gain, which indicates the entire system. The only studies that can be recruited for this are studies for which we had a dry lot beginning phase for a high forage diet and obviously a finishing phase. In this case, the system total average daily gain was not affected, neither was intake by offering cattle a higher roughage diet during a growing period. No grazing cattle were in those data sets, neither in this one right here, because obviously we don't have any information on intake when cattle are out grazing. The feed conversion was not effective with a p-value of 0.17. So overall, the conclusion is if we choose to use a higher roughage diet in a dry lot, or the response on an overall conversion efficiency, overall gain or intake are not really affected by that. One interesting feature of this meta-analysis, and I was never expecting to see this, is that carcass value tends to, if you allow me to use a 0.10 to call a statistical trend, with a value on carcass, this would be dollars, approaching perhaps a Hedges G value of about 0.5, and 2 or 3 or 4 of them studies surely showing a positive response on carcass value. You may recall we talked earlier about cattle that were finished days on feed, and it so happens that this particular study, the study was terminated when cattle had reached so many days, not so many inches of fat, and those cattle did not have the carcass value to pull closer to a zero difference in that particular study. So so far, what we can say is that intake may be lower, but gain is not limited when roughage is zero. Raising beef and dairy cattle under a growing finishing system is uncommon from at least the information that I understand. And then there are many research groups out there attempting to look at either grazing or the use of high roughage diets to grow cattle. My recommendation to those groups and to anybody attempting to use more forage in the diets of beef on dairy cattle is that definitely we need to finish those cattle at the same degree of finish, not days on feed. The incentives today in the marketplace are obviously carcass value, which is really carcass weight by the quality attributes of that carcass, which I will get into here in a little bit. So if you want to take away something with regards to what should be the fiber concentration in diets of beef on dairy cattle, certainly more fiber in the diet supports greater intake, but average daily gain decreases rapidly beyond 15.5% physically effective NDF, and so does feed conversion efficiency. So we're going to continue the game of where can I take these cattle for intake without affecting feed conversion. And that range might be between 10 and 15% of total NDF. So can I feed a 14% corn stover diet? I would not do that for a number of reasons. Economics, sorting, the challenges with grinding corn stover, and I am speaking only about corn stover, and then of course storage of these products. So generally, NDF source is not a factor in determining performance response. So if you go back and look at the literature, the type of NDF doesn't generally have an effect on the response. I will say, however, for at least cattle that are of Holstein breeding or beef on dairy breeds, there is at least between Holstein and beef breeds, there's a big difference in dry matter intake, with quotes of 2.2% of the body weight as intake for Holstein breeds versus 2.15 for beef breeds. Well, what does that tell me? That at about 1,100 pounds of animal weight, there is about a half a pound of dry matter difference in intake. What does this mean in terms of ruminal function? But that obviously this critter here will have a faster rate of passage from the rumen. So if I'm going to have faster rate of passage, and I need to use that both from a fiber perspective as well as a nutrient provision perspective, I need to provide better quality roughage when I'm feeding dairy animals. And I will extend that to beef on dairy, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. So lower quality forage for me means less time for ruminal digestion and more time too for negative associative effects in the rumen and quite possibly in the small intestine, probably leading to a reduction in post-ruminal digestibility of the entire diet, not just of the roughage itself. Here is data from that same meta-analysis. This was not incorporated because this is grazing data, just simply comparing the beef breeds against the beef on dairy breeds for in body weight, slightly heavier for the beef breeds, that's fine. Out body weight, however, look how much farther behind the beef on dairy breeds were. This is when cattle went out to graze. And the rate of gain obviously was 1.2 versus 1.7, leading obviously to this difference of 785. So about almost 50-pound difference on the outweight of these stocker cattle. Now, this is not saying that we shouldn't graze cattle. All I'm using this data set is to estimate dry matter based on the intake and the net energy provided by the diet from these forages those cattle were exposed to. So if I back calculate the net energy of gain in megacalories per unit of metabolic body weight, you will recall that number should be 0.077, which for the beef group of animals, that number came back to 0.078. For the beef on dairy, however, that number is 0.097, might as well be 0.1. This is almost 24% greater value than this number, which is telling me quite correctly that because I put a little bit of dairy on this beef animal, the maintenance requirements have gone up. So the answer back to the forage inclusion, the better the quality forage, the better the response will be because they have no time to be spending time and calories ingesting and digesting poor quality forage, leading to poorer performance by these animals. And again, this applies both to grazing as well as cattle that are in a dry lot. So for me, if we're going to increase fiber inclusion on these beef on dairy diets, we're going to have to do it with a better quality forage. I wanted to wrap up with this. The fat content in that meta-analysis, in that fat content, this would be that rib fat depth on cattle that were finished in that meta-analysis shows how the p-value indicates to me probably not much of a difference. Likely, if it would be a difference someday, it would go to say that cattle that were fed a higher forage diet or graze had lower fat. Well, we would have guessed that based on the fact that some of the studies finished these cattle days on feed. Yet when you look at marbling, that's not a negative thing. That's on the positive side of that, meaning that cattle that were grown or grazed and then finished, they tended to have slightly better marbling. So when you look in here, all of these dots are falling to the right of the zero, which is a good thing. The ribeye was also not affected. So if I choose to feed more forage at some point or graze some of these beef and dairy cattle, I will not expect marbling or ribeye area to be affected. Hopefully the fat content or the fat depth rather, not content, will be improved because I'm finishing on same day some feed. To sort of prove this point, I have this chart right here which explains what happens when we retain beef and dairy cattle for longer days on feed. This is the same diet. This has zero to do with using roughage. Cattle that arrived at 323 days on feed on this experiment had been fed a high energy diet from day one in their feedlot. And their contemporaries were retained 344, 362, or 385 days. Carcass value is represented on the right, and the value change is represented on the left. So when you read these bars, you're reading against the left. When you read this line, you're reading against the right. So rather than explaining choice and prime and all of that, the marbling value related value is the blue bar. The fat cover or yield grade values is in the red bar, obviously, as cattle are more days on feed. This is the easiest thing to explain to you. Yield grade goes up and the value of that carcass goes down. DC is for carcasses that display dark cutting color, and this would be heifers, so there's an expectation that that will get worse. So as you look at the bar that is red, or rather yellow, that is staying pretty flat. The marbling or the quality grade, this is what makes beef taste better, actually improves over time. Because of the proportion of carcasses that go up versus the ones that go down, et cetera, all those iterations are considered into carcass value. And you can see how carcass value continued to improve. This is, you might say, gross income or gross revenue. This next chart would explain what happens on the return on investment rather than spending too much time on all this stuff. What this indicates to us that cattle that were finished at 323 days had a return on investment of 15%, but retaining their contemporaries over to 362 days because of better carcass value led to a greater return on investment. Going beyond that, dropped it to 17.9, which is lower than the one at 362 days, but still better than at 344 or 323 days. So there is certainly some economic incentives for keeping cattle on feed longer, particularly now. I'm not saying this is going to be the reality into the future. The other incentive, and it has little to do with economy, a lot to do with changes we have had in this country on implant labels, is that if we introduce what is called a grower period, FDA recognizes that as independent from a finisher period, with each of these periods having the opportunity to apply one implant. So now I have given myself the opportunity to apply these various choices of implants that are in this inscribed on this arrow, or these choices of implants that are inscribed on this arrow. If you extended this finisher arrow back to receiving, we only have one shot at it. And at the most, those implant programs will only be about 200, 220 days. So it doesn't cover the 300 days that exist plus between the end of receiving and harvest period. So with that, Fred, I'm going to turn it over to questions, discussion, etc.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that have come in, but I'd invite folks to go ahead and unmute and ask questions directly. We're kind of a smallish group, so if you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute and ask your question. I'll kind of give people a minute to compose their question. Tracy asked, has there been any research done to differentiate between beef from conventional dairy farms versus those that are from grass-based?
To my knowledge, no, we have not begun to do that. I'm assuming that may be in a certain future, as obviously taste and the desire to have an experience eating beef from different perspectives is revealed through our production channels.
Very good. Can you put any comments out there about is there a genetic or breed element to what your research is telling you?
Uh, Specifically from this research, the answer would be nebulous on breed choice, mainly because it was biased by the research studies that were recruited for this mini meta-analyses. So in many cases, these were Angus on Holstein and perhaps Sim Angus on Holstein, very little of other breeds. I could certainly not put that on a class variable for my analyses because there were so few observations. I had to group them somehow just to even create that contrast. And as you all can tell, the p-values are fairly weak, but they reveal some trends. Um, my own consideration, because we were sort of working with this early on, is to look at breeds that will enhance muscling. And I'm assuming the question comes from what should I be using on a Holstein or a Jersey cow or a dairy cow to get the best crossbreeding out of that. And to me, breeds that are going to improve on ribeye size and I can say from the experience that we had back at that time that Limflex, which is Angus Limousine, was able to correct that quite right. I mean, on one crossbreeding for the cattle that resulted from that, nearly 100% or 100% of cattle we produced on those Riverview's early studies were not ever discounted as dairy breeds. Um, from what I know from dairy breeds, they tend to retain marbling quite well, particularly the Jersey. So I'm not as worried about rectifying or I'm worried about retaining marbling, but I'm not worried about bringing in marbling when I'm choosing or I'm considering a beef or a beef breed to cross on some of these dairy cows.
Very good. Matt asked us, based on the metadata analysis, did you find any effects on fiber inclusion on liver abscesses?
Excellent question, and the data are very spotty on their report for liver abscesses. So I remained I abstained from analyzing that, but suffice it to say, there was, as you all could tell, very few observations, and there was really no trend that indicated that higher forage was going to reduce liver abscesses. There was maybe one or two studies in which it did, but across the board it did not. Just the label grow finish was not associated, at least visually observing what I had in front of me, it was not associated with lower liver abscess incidence.
Okay. Dan asked us, Was the meta-analysis based on only one sex, steers versus heifers? Our observation is that heifers need to be grown to prevent early finishing. This may be dependent on the net energy in the starter diet.
Very, very good point. There is two studies at least, I gotta try and think, for which both steers and heifers were utilized in the meta-analysis. So the answer cannot be specific to one breed or another, and I would agree with Dan that as feedlots, let's go specifically to feedlots or pens, are comprised of heifers that certainly a forage period is more necessary, and maybe the net energy of gain formulation for those diets ought to be in the 56, 58 range for a bit longer than for their counterpart steers. And this could be in the same feedlot across the alley from the set of steers, perhaps from the same dairy, for which I would say a little bit more energy is required on the steer than on the heifer from a beef on dairy cross. And again, that information on maintenance requirements of these cattle is the reason perhaps that Holstein cattle were fed to a greater amount of net energy of gain for longer to try and avoid the tax of higher maintenance affecting gain and feed conversion. So that remains somewhat of a consideration, not a concern, a consideration for feeding beef on dairy steers versus beef on dairy heifers.
Thank you. Roger asks, did you establish a minimum percentage of NDF inclusion of ration formulation for finished beef on dairy cattle?
Not from the meta-analyses. I would say that based on a different meta-analyses, let's kind of equalize what we're talking here. I believe at 10% roughage inclusion, rather than talking NDF or effective NDF or whatever, because that gets confused real quick. And when I say 10% roughage inclusion, corn silage would only contribute 50% of its proportion to this number. So if we were trying to derive a working number from these observations, 10% is a good finishing number of, and this is roughage, for a finishing diet of beef on dairy animals. So what should that be for a steer, as I just finished saying, on a growing diet, perhaps 15% for 56 days, perhaps. For a heifer, I think we can play with all the way up to 18, 20% for a good long time before we turn them on to a finisher diet.
Very good. Matt asks, do you have any thoughts on the effect of starch source, ground versus unground, moisture levels, steam flaking, and starch digestibility on the need for forage fiber to maintain intake and growth?
Very, very good question. To me, the more sophisticated the energy source is for, to just sort of lack of a better term, and that would be steam flake corn, high moisture corn, the more sophisticated the quality of the fiber should be. Because that is where we require faster rates of digestion in the rumen, and the benefits of at least steam flake corn preserve into the small intestine, and having a poorly digestible roughage source would cause some problems both in the rumen and in the small intestine for digestion and absorption, just because of the negative associated effects, at least in the rumen, and perhaps delay in absorption in the small intestine.
Very good. Remind everybody that they can type in questions or they can unmute and ask directly. And I'll ask one question of my own. Is the ingredient price, I mean, now we have fairly inexpensive corn, fairly inexpensive roughage, and high beef prices. Is there a sliding scale in there that would affect your recommendations?
Um, I guess I don't think so, Fred. Uh, when I look at, for instance, steam flake corn, you would suspect that, we always say, well, high corn prices make us think of more sophisticated processing opportunities for corn. Certainly, and interestingly, there's actually a curve where the need for better performance, if you can put it that way, between steam flake corn and dry roll corn as a reference gets smaller and smaller the higher the price is. So let's just say at $4 corn, I need about a 6% improvement in feed digestibility, feed conversion from steam flake corn relative to dry roll corn. As it goes to $7, when we've been there in 3 years ago, um, that number decreases to about 3 to 4% improvement needed by feeding steam flake corn over dry corn. And it's something that's almost interesting to watch. So the answer would be, if we follow that scale for high moisture corn, for example, and it applies the same way relative to dry roll corn, that improvement in digestibility needs to be less as the price of the ingredients, particularly corn, goes higher. So the recommendation on grain processing will not change, or it will actually be for greater processing as corn prices increase. Same way, the quality of the roughage that accompanies that higher uh, or better or more fermentable starch source should track that. So if we're using, we cannot use corn stalks on $8 corn processed steam flake corn, put it that way. At that point, I better be looking at alfalfa hay.
Thank you. Joel asks, is there a place for earlage or ground cobs?
Certainly. Earlage, so earlage and high moisture corn, I'm not going to say they're the same, but earlage has the capacity to add a fair amount of roughage. Where the challenge for earlage is if I'm doing a darn good job of earlage, and I hope everyone is, um, then it resembles a grain source. And I'm just going to say a grain source. I will not say a high moisture corn source. What I mean by that is that if we expect the grain content of earlage to be 80%, 85%, then we treat it as a grain source. If for whatever reason, and in the old days, it was between 70 and 80%. So if for whatever reason, our earlage product comes back at 75% or so um, corn content, then I have to be a little careful about its inclusion. In other words, it has sufficient fiber to create some negativity or negative associative effects in the rumen. So in that scenario, I would limit earlage inclusion to below a third or 33% of the diet dry and a diet dry matter basis in that scenario. If it's really high quality earlage, 85% or so, and I'll come back to how we calculate that in 1 second, then I could potentially go all the way to about 50% earlage in the diet. Now, what's the easiest way to figure out how much corn you have in earlage? The simplest way for me is you take the starch content of earlage. If we assume that corn is now at about 75% starch, multiply, 75% by 80, 85%, and we're well over 60% starch in that calculation, right? So if it's old-fashioned made earlage, for lack of a better term, then we're going to be in that 50, 55% starch content.
Very good. I'll slip in a question here and we might be down to the end of the questions. With the better processing of milo and sorghums, where will they fit in?
Can you repeat the processing type of these grains?
Well, Shear has come out a couple of years ago, I think,
Yeah.
with a better processor that will crack those seeds.
Yeah,
How will that change things for us as feeders?
yeah. Well, I would still, so my experience with Milo long, long ago and probably high tannin varieties back in the day would be that it had to be ground pretty fine. And it might approach whole corn on an energy value basis. If we're talking that type of product, then it would help me balance some of the highly fermentable grain sources or grain processing that I may have going on. For example, do I want to balance some steam flake corn with some ground Milo? Yes, I could certainly consider doing that. Do I want to balance some high moisture corn with some processed Milo? Certainly, I would consider doing that. I would not expect, even with today's varieties, just because of the starch content of Milo, um, that it will reach the energy concentration that we would expect. Back to the heifer versus steer question, Milo and heifers, or a higher proportion of Milo in the diet for heifers, yes. A higher proportion of Milo in the diet of steers, again, beef and dairy, probably not. In other words, not 70% of the grain mix as Milo for these beef and dairy steers.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing other questions. Thank you for sharing this information and your insights and strategies concerning the beef on dairy ration. This program has been recorded and will be available on the I-29 MU University website located at i29muu.com/beef-on-dairy-dialogue. Give us 3 to 5 days to get it up. In addition, I will email you when it is available and will include the link to the program evaluation. Please consider filling it out. It helps us make better programs every year. Thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you at the webinar next month when Chip Kemp will discuss how to align your beef on dairy goals with sire selection. I'll conclude by wishing everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. At this point, we will end the program.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.